The church was growing and people were getting saved. In the fall of 1990, the Faith Christian Academy merged with VCY and became the Badger State Baptist School.
VCY had a school at that time, and they really wanted to put all their energy in their radio and not have to deal with the school.
It was a big deal for us to merge and change our name.
A number of the families that became a part of our church, and some of them, that's where the Dakina family came over from.
1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." Near the end of 1991, Pastor Rose resigned as pastor.
The church was going through a hard time, as any church that goes through difficulty and loses their pastor goes and faces. As the assistant pastor, and on top of that, the son-in-law of the pastor, it was very difficult.
My husband just thought it would be best if we left the church, resigned.
But the thing about it is that this church, Faith Baptist, and its people loved my dad and didn't want him to leave.
And assistant pastor, Larry Borner, filled in as interim pastor. The pulpit committee began the search for the new pastor.
I was on that committee, and Pastor Noonan was the youth pastor at that time, and we had a man assistant pastor also at that time. And they would take turns preaching, actually. And it was so obvious to all of us that God's hand was on Pastor Noonan.
I remember there was another man that was a strong candidate, and I kept praying, Lord, he's not one of us. And not that he wasn't in faith or doctrine, but he hadn't been here. And it was so clear to so many of us that it was supposed to be preacher, and it was.
I had no interest in being pastor. I loved being a youth pastor. And it was during that time, God began to really work in my heart early in 1992, after Christmas there and so on. And God and I wrestled for a while. I thought, what if the next pastor doesn't want me to be youth pastor? I'm going to have to go somewhere else. Or what if I don't want to serve under the next pastor? Well, through that, the Lord made it very clear to me that He wanted me to be a pastor. And then I wondered, well, what if they don't want me to be the pastor?
In March of 1992, the church called Pastor Noonan to be the next pastor of Faith Baptist Church.
As I began to pastor, I was 28 years old and a bit overwhelmed, especially coming into the pastorate with a church that was hurting and struggling. And so I wanted to minister to the people and wanted to help pull people back together and move on then as a church. Of course, I wanted to continue and emphasize the winning of souls and our missions program. And I felt if we would just keep loving people, winning people to Christ, and helping the gospel get around the world, God would take care of the rest.
Over the next few years, the church had steady growth in every ministry. The buses were bringing in hundreds of people. There were A, B, and C Sunday school programs all taking place at different times of the weekend. People being saved during outreach, street preaching, and in the services.
Those first 3 years, the church just exploded. Our outreach exploded.
When Amy and I first came to Faith Baptist Church, I helped Kevin Holland. He had bus 3, and within really weeks of being at Faith Baptist Church, he wanted me to help out in the bus ministry. And I had never heard of a bus ministry. Again, Amy and I were Catholic background. I had no idea what a bus ministry was. So I was involved in the bus ministry, and just within 3 weeks, Kevin sat down with me and said, "Hey, I'm going off to Bible college." He was a senior in high school. "I'm going off to Bible college, and how about you take over the bus route?"
I had just moved here from a small country church out in the middle of nowhere. Church averaged 250. I had a bus route there, but nothing like this. And then we moved here. I moved here, and a city bus. That was quite different. You could pack as many kids as possible. There was no regulations on that bus.
I generally always lived in the bus one area right there, and up and down Greenfield and Orchard Street there. So that's kind of how, the title of bus kid. I walked at first, half and half, but then I definitely became somewhat a full-time bus kid from there.
In 1995, the church was averaging 1,000 people in Sunday school, with a high day of 1,600. For the second year in a row, 2,000 people were baptized.
That was really the heyday of the bus ministry, especially, I think, nationwide, really, but at Faith Baptist Church. There was a big, big, big push for bus routes, bus ministry, people getting involved in the ministry.
It was crazy and it was awesome at the same time. It was kind of like a speeding train and trying to hold on to it for a lot of that time. And it was exciting being a kid during those times because you were seeing people, just lives being transformed. Kids are coming on the route, and it was an amazing time of just serving the Lord.
Big one was Overcomers. Brother Don and Lisa had started that and asked my boyfriend at the time and I to start working in that with them. And those were incredible years. We would start off at 7 a.m. We would leave our home and we would get ready to go start the buses, and hopefully they started. And we would get off and we would go get the children, bring them to church for Sunday school, church, and then we would keep them all afternoon. And after night church, we would take them home on the bus. So it was like a 7 a.m. to a 10 p.m. day.
Everything was moving along until it wasn't.
Of course, the church had been, seeing many people saved, and I don't think the enemy liked that, and he wanted to stop what was happening, and so we had a church split.
There was a big week where we lost a good number of people. We talked about half of the people that didn't show up. But then it was a slow trickle. You'd come back to church and like, who's going to be gone? I just had just the worst feeling for really months.
I remember talking to my mom about it, and she said to me, "Was it God's will for you to be here?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Did the preacher do anything morally wrong?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, then you better stay put and see what God will do." So I stayed put.
2 Timothy 2. But in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and of silver, but also of wood and earth, and some to honor and some to dishonor. If a man therefore purge himself of these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. And I thought, wow, this is going to be hard. And I turned the page or two, and on the next page it says something like this: now endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And I was willing to do whatever it took, whatever the Lord wanted us to go through during that time.
With over half the congregation gone, the church struggled under the weight of the ministry. Ministry leaders were here one week and gone the next.
Many of the people that left were bus ministry people, bus captains, bus drivers, bus workers. So we scaled back to the number of routes actually we have today. Those four people that stayed, the 4 routes that stayed and have remained now for years.
I remember sitting in a Saturday bus meeting after the split. And the Saturday bus, you had to be there before when it was like this. The Saturday bus meetings were packed. I mean, that day it was a small group of us looking around like, what am I going to do? And I remember Brother Jeff looking at me and saying, "You're taking the route, right?" I was only a worker. I got 3 teenagers for you. Here you go. And handed me bus 1.
We had very, very few musicians at the time, and Brother Jeff sang every Sunday morning before preacher preached.
And I remember Brother Matt Takina, who I believe was a sophomore, looked over and said, "Hey, are we having a soccer team?" And just with all the confidence in the world, I didn't know any of the kids, but I'm like, "Of course we're having a soccer team. Are you playing?" And it was that type of a mindset that Becky and I had, was to just kind of come in and try to restore a semblance of order and try to be a help and a anchoring, a ballast, if you will.
Financially, the deficit was worse. The offerings dropped by 75%, and all the staff took a pay cut.
There was something that I was taught as a young boy, and one of the things I just never considered was I was going to quit. I wasn't going to quit, and just didn't know what was going to happen. Me and the few staff members that were still around went out and got jobs outside of the church, stopped taking a paycheck to make sure that the church would still pay its bills, and we kept pressing on.
God gave immense and amazing wisdom to preacher.
I remember, once again, sitting in a teacher's meeting and preacher coming to us. I don't remember the timeline of it. I just remember him saying to all of us, "I'm sorry, I have no money to pay you. If you choose to leave, you can, but I'd really appreciate it if you'd continue teaching." And I remember asking him after, teaching with no pay, he said, "I don't know when I'll ever be able to pay you again." So I thought, okay, God, here we go. So I took on a second job. That's when I went to work for Big Apple Bagel. And I worked taught all day. And then I would go work there all evening, work weekends, just to make ends meet.
It took a strong resolve to come into the face of that, knowing that it was going to be rough. We ended up going without paychecks, but Becky and I, we felt like this is exactly like Esther. We're called for such a time as this.
We kept trusting in God, and we had to work really, really hard.
You know, the staff, we wouldn't get paid sometimes, and that's the way it was, and that was fine with us. Amy and I were young, and we weren't making a whole lot of money anyway in the school. And I don't look back at that time as even, again, God had his hand on all this, and how we paid the bills, the church, even pastor, and we joke about it, and the treasurer, like how did this even happen? But God had his hand on Faith Baptist Church all the way through this.
I had won a trip from pastor school to the Bahamas. And so I was in the Bahamas. This was a number of months after the split. And I was there with Brother Hiles and several other pastors. And it was sitting in the airport with Dr. Hiles, and he said, "So how's the church going?" And I said, good. And he kept prodding. Later, I realized he was already aware of the church trouble. I had not spoke of it. And he was also aware that I was working 2 jobs outside of the church, not getting paid. And as we boarded the plane that day, he handed me a napkin folded up and said, the napkin read, "When you get home, resign your 2 jobs and start pastoring the church again. I will personally be paying your salary." And for the next 4 months, Dr. Hiles paid my salary so I could focus on pastoring the church, working with the school. And it was at the end of those 4 months that the church was able to take me back on full time, and we continued to move ahead.